They always had something to say about the way I felt things. Too much. Too often. Too deeply. If I asked a question, it was overthinking. If I stayed quiet, it was being moody. If I cried, it was dramatic. I learned early that the safest way to survive in this family was to feel everything silently and show nothing. But silence, I've come to realize, doesn't make the feelings go away. It just teaches them to hide better. My name is Rachel Monroe. I'm 29. Youngest of 3. Officially irrelevant, at least according to the family power structure. I didn't say that to be bitter. I used to. Now I say it like a fact, the same way you'd say the sky is blue or that my brother Ethan thinks emotions are a distraction. He's the oldest, big voice, big logic, big ego. Sophie's the middle, brand genius, sharp tongue, allergic to softness. And then there's me. The one they call sweet when they're being polite, emotional when they're not. Growing up, they liked me best when I was quiet and agreeable. If I laughed at their jokes, I was in. If I challenged them, even gently, I was told I was reading too much into things. That phrase followed me like a shadow. You're reading too much into it. It became their get out of accountability free card. No matter how pointed their comments, no matter how hollow the smiles afterward. If I reacted, I was the problem. So I trained myself not to react. I didn't understand what anxiety was at first. I just thought I was bad at life. I thought everyone's chest felt tight when they got a phone call. I thought it was normal to replay every conversation in your head until 3 in the morning, editing your tone, rewriting your words, calculating if you'd accidentally offended someone. I thought everybody secretly measured their value by how little they inconvenienced others. I didn't know it had a name. I didn't know other people felt it too. What I did know was how to prepare. Over-prepare. Preempt. I got good at noticing the shift in someone's voice before they even knew they were irritated. I could feel tension forming in a room before a single word was spoken. I made careers out of it, first in marketing, then in behavioral strategy. Turns out, anxiety makes you very, very good at seeing patterns. But at home, none of that mattered. At home, I was still the little sister who felt too much. The family business wasn't mine. It belonged to Ethan, Sophie, and our mother, Linda. A locally grown wellness store that used to thrive before the market shifted. Dad built it, they took over, and I watched it slowly unravel from the sidelines. Not because I didn't care, but because they never asked me to step in. The only time they pulled me in was to ask me to post something nice on my Instagram or help explain a new app they didn't understand. And then they'd laugh when I got too technical. There she goes again. Overthinking it. I'd smile. Pretend I didn't notice the edge in their voice. Pretend the knots in my stomach weren't tightening. Pretend I didn't want to scream. They didn't see me as fragile. They just didn't see me at all. But here's what I've learned about anxiety. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you perceptive. And the day would come when those very instincts they mocked would be the ones that saved everything they were too proud to protect. They just didn't know it yet. The store was like another family member. One they respected more than me. It had a name before I did. Monroe Market. A bright, earthy space nestled in a walkable part of town, lined with hand-labeled jars, artisanal teas, and an idealistic origin story about Dad leaving his corporate job to bring health back to the people. That narrative lived in every wooden shelf and mason jar. But Dad was gone now, and so was the soul of the place. After his funeral, they didn't grieve. They reorganized. Ethan took over operations. Sophie handled branding. Mom quietly slipped into the background, occasionally reviewing numbers but mostly keeping her distance. I wasn't assigned a role. No one said it directly, they just didn't consider me part of the machine. I had a career of my own in Seattle. I was the outlier. And yet I found myself back there more often than I expected, orbiting a business I wasn't allowed to touch but couldn't quite walk away from. Ethan ran the place like a CEO prepping for a merger that would never come. Profit margins. Vendor contracts. Wholesale analytics. He spoke like he was presenting to investors, even when he was just updating Sophie on shelf restocking. His voice made you feel like questions were threats. Sophie, meanwhile, redesigned the store every 2 months. Fonts, colors, window displays. Constantly reinventing the look without ever addressing what customers actually wanted. Aesthetic without empathy. Mom didn't say much. She'd sit in the office occasionally, looking over numbers like they were ancient relics, clinging to spreadsheets from a better decade. She wasn't cruel, just numb. The kind of quiet that had once looked like composure but now felt like absence. And then there was me, still Rachel, still the little sister, still visiting. I'd watch inventory decisions get made without a single conversation about customer behavior. I'd hear them debate signage, packaging, and vendor swaps, but never once mention retention, loyalty, or emotional trust. It felt like they were trying to fix a sinking ship by painting the sails a nicer color. I remember offering a small suggestion once. They were discussing how foot traffic had dropped and I said, "Have we asked customers why they're not coming back?" Ethan blinked like I'd spoken in Morse code. Sophie didn't even look up. We don't really need a survey. We know why. It's competition. Big box stores. Price wars. I swallowed my instinct to push further. I had charts. I had theories. I had a digital dashboard that mapped out local engagement patterns and shifting consumer sentiment. But I also had a history of being spoken over. I wasn't about to audition for relevance again. The store still smelled like dried lavender and citrus, but the energy was stale. Transactions without connection. Strategy without story. Every time I walked in, I felt the weight of what wasn't being said. The denial. The egos. The refusal to adapt. And beneath it all, the silence of being underestimated. I'd walk the aisles like a ghost. Customers would browse quietly. Sometimes I'd make conversation just to test the waters. Hey, how did you first hear about us? They'd pause, surprised anyone asked. Some mumbled, I used to come here years ago. Others said, I didn't know you were still open. Still open. That phrase hit like a diagnosis. Because that's what the store was, still open but not really alive. And I knew that kind of dying intimately. It was the same kind that happens to people who are told their voice doesn't count. You go through the motions but the soul is gone. I didn't need a title to see the cracks. I didn't need a seat at the table to notice the emotional rot underneath all the spreadsheets. I'd seen it my whole life, people ignoring the obvious because it made them uncomfortable. But discomfort was where I lived. And quietly I started watching more closely. Not as a sister. Not even as a strategist. But as someone who finally understood that being outside the system meant I could see what they couldn't. It wasn't just the store falling apart. It was the story they told themselves about who mattered. The fall didn't happen all at once. It never does. It crept in quietly, the way burnout does or grief. A few fewer customers here, a slightly shorter line there. A slow week that turned into a slow month. At first they called it seasonal. Then they blamed the economy. Then it was just a rough patch. Denial wrapped in logic, packaged and resold like truth. But I could see the pattern. A big box wellness chain had opened just a few blocks away. Sleek design, loyalty apps, influencer tie-ins, express delivery. They didn't just sell organic food. They sold emotional ease. And customers chased ease the way thirsty roots chase water. Meanwhile, Monroe Market stayed exactly the same. Charming but outdated, stubbornly analog, clinging to a legacy that wasn't enough anymore. Ethan doubled down on price cuts. We'll beat them at their own game, he said, slashing margins like that would magically generate loyalty. Sophie ordered new signage and fresh uniforms. We just need to look more polished, she said, like branding could cover the cracks in the foundation. Linda, as always, offered context but no vision. We just need to ride it out. Ride it out. I heard that phrase so many times I started counting. It was their favorite sedative. Meant to calm panic but really just avoid action. Meanwhile, customer traffic dropped by 18%. I knew that because I'd been quietly running local traffic analysis on my own. They hadn't asked me to, but anxiety has a way of turning worry into homework. I created dashboards, studied competitors, mapped behavioral shifts post-COVID, tracked customer sentiment in neighborhood forums. I wasn't trying to be heroic. I was just trying not to drown in helplessness. Watching something fall apart while knowing how to fix it is its own kind of grief. Once, over lunch, I brought up the idea of emotional storytelling. What if we shared the store's journey, Dad's legacy, the risks you guys took to keep it alive, how hard it's been? I said it gently, like a whisper I knew would be ignored. Sophie gave a tight smile. We don't want to look desperate. Ethan shook his head. That kind of thing works for startups. We're not an Instagram brand. I nodded and bit my tongue. But inside I screamed. Because I understood something they didn't. People don't buy products anymore. They buy identity. Emotion. Connection. They follow stories that reflect their own. We weren't losing to better prices. We were losing to emotional disconnection. So I said nothing. I kept listening. Watching. Studying. Not because I was waiting for an invitation, I had long stopped expecting one, but because some part of me couldn't look away. Like standing in a house with a leaking roof, watching everyone mop the floor and ignore the hole above them. The longer I stayed, the more I realized their pride was louder than their fear. And that's dangerous. Pride drowns you faster than panic. Panic at least makes you grab a lifeline. Pride lets you sink quietly with your mouth shut and your chin up. And yet I didn't walk away. I kept coming back. Weekends, evenings, holidays. Fixing broken systems in my head. Seeing what they refused to see. Because that's what anxiety does, doesn't it? It sharpens your vision. It forces you to prepare for worst-case scenarios before anyone else notices the shift in the air. It turns you into a human radar system, for risk, for rejection, for collapse. They laughed at that, called it paranoia. But I called it pattern recognition. Anxiety taught me to scan the horizon for storms. They just called it weather. It was a Tuesday night. Late. The kind of night where the fluorescent lights hum louder than the people inside. I had stayed behind to restock tea tins, a task no one had asked me to do but someone needed to, and I was already used to filling in invisible gaps. I was in the back storeroom when I heard their voices, Ethan and Sophie. They didn't know I was still there. "She's sweet," Ethan said, his voice low but sharp with finality, "but she's just not built for this." There was a pause. The kind that holds more truth than words ever could. Sophie let out a half-laugh, the kind that sounded like it had been waiting a long time to be spoken. "Yeah. I mean, it's cute that she tries. But this is business." My hands froze over the glass jars. For a moment, everything inside me collapsed, like it had so many times before. My stomach dropped. My throat tightened. I waited for the shame to flood in, to make me small again, to remind me that my place in this family was ornamental at best. But something strange happened instead. I didn't spiral. I didn't cry. I didn't even move. I just stood there, clear. This time it didn't destroy me. It clarified me. Because for the first time I realized they weren't right. They were simply limited. And their laughter didn't make me smaller. It made their vision smaller. I didn't sleep that night. But I didn't toss and turn in self-doubt either. I opened my laptop and started building. Not an argument. Not a rebuttal. A plan. I mapped out the customer journey. Every pain point. Every missed opportunity. Every emotional cue they'd ignored. I drafted a loyalty system using behavioral nudges. Loss aversion, habit stacking, consistency rewards. I identified local micro-influencers aligned with our values and sketched out an outreach template. I built emotional storytelling campaigns, honest ones, about the grief of losing dad, about resilience, about anxiety and entrepreneurship, about the cost of pretending you're fine when you're not. By sunrise, I had a 22-page pitch deck, a 3-month execution timeline, and a quiet fire inside me that I hadn't felt in years. I didn't build it to prove anything to them. That was the old me, desperate to be taken seriously, desperate for a seat at a table that never made space for me. This was different. I wasn't asking for permission anymore. I wasn't trying to be believed. I was just ready to act. The next morning I walked in before the store opened and placed the folder on the counter. Ethan looked up from his laptop. Sophie barely glanced my way. "I have a proposal," I said, calm and even. "Not because I need your approval, but because you need a way forward. This is it." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Rachel, I don't think now's." I held up a hand. Not rudely. Just firmly. "Read it. You don't have to like me. But the numbers don't lie." And then I walked out. Not dramatically. Just decisively. For once, I didn't wait for their reaction to determine my value. I knew what I had. I knew what they didn't. And I was done waiting to be invited into a place I already belonged. It wasn't rebellion. It was reclamation. Because I wasn't the girl in the storeroom anymore. I was the woman with the blueprint. Strange what happens when you finally stop asking for permission. The world doesn't end. You don't combust. The sky doesn't fall. You just breathe differently. More fully. I remember that morning after I dropped off the proposal. I didn't rush back for feedback. I didn't refresh my phone. I didn't pace by the storeroom waiting to be summoned. I went home. Made coffee. Took a long walk. And for the first time in years I didn't feel like I had something to prove. Because I had already proven it. To myself. They gave me silence. I answered with strategy. What I'd built in that overnight haze wasn't just a pitch deck. It was the accumulation of years of being ignored and still paying attention. While they debated fonts and discounts, I had been studying behavior. Consumer psychology. Emotional triggers. Real-time engagement funnels. Every anxiety spiral I'd ever had was a masterclass in contingency planning. Every sleepless night I spent obsessing over what-ifs had trained me to see around corners. This plan wasn't a theory. It was a map out of the storm they refused to name. At the heart of it was a single truth. People don't buy what you sell. They buy how you make them feel. Monroe Market had lost that. Not because we didn't have quality goods, but because we'd stopped being human. We'd become a business that whispered from behind dusty shelves instead of speaking directly to the hearts of the people who once believed in us. So I built a new way forward. First, a digital loyalty system, anchored in loss aversion and microcommitment psychology. Customers would receive points not just for purchases but for consistency. Every week they returned, they'd unlock emotional milestones. You showed up again. So do we. The goal wasn't just to keep them, it was to make them feel seen for staying. Then I pulled a list of 5 local micro-influencers, people who weren't celebrities, but who were deeply embedded in the community. Moms who shared real struggles with wellness. Teachers who posted grocery hauls with transparency. Young professionals juggling health and burnout. I drafted custom outreach messages. No corporate tone. Just, we're rebuilding from the inside out. We want you to be part of the story. I rewrote the brand voice, not from scratch but from truth. No more polished phrases or sterile slogans. Just honesty. We talk about dad. About grief. About legacy. About how hard it is to run a family business when the family itself is cracked. About the fear of becoming irrelevant. About anxiety, mine and the customers. Because customers I knew were anxious too. About food. About trust. About being sold to. This wasn't just marketing. It was empathy. The last part of the plan, and the part one knew they'd resist the most, was a soft launch campaign titled, Why We Almost Closed. It was raw. Vulnerable. It told the truth they were too proud to say. We lost our way. And we know you noticed. But we're not done yet. This store was built on hope. And we still believe in that. That line made me cry when I wrote it. Not because it was good copy, but because it was finally real. When I returned to the store 2 days later, the folder was gone. Ethan didn't say anything. Sophie didn't either. But Linda stopped me in the hallway. She looked at me with something I hadn't seen in her eyes in a long time. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. I read it, she said. You think this could actually work? I met her eyes. It's not a gamble. It's what they're already asking for. We've just stopped listening. She nodded once and walked away. And that was it. No meeting. No handshake. No applause. But later that week, Ethan forwarded me a login to the store's back-end marketing portal. No subject line. Just the credentials. I didn't need their praise. I had access. And in silence I began. There was no grand meeting. No ribbon cutting. No big announcement that I was now part of the team. Ethan didn't thank me. Sophie didn't acknowledge the pitch. And yet, within the week I saw the first ripple. A new loyalty tab live on the website. The messaging matched the copy I'd written. We're still here and so are you. I stared at it for a while, heart thudding. They still didn't say my name. But they used my words. For someone like me, someone trained by years of emotional silence to not expect credit, this was the language I understood. Subtle shifts. Quiet adoption. It wasn't recognition in the traditional sense, but I'd stopped needing applause. What I wanted now was impact. So I leaned in. Without ceremony, I began managing the rollout. I set up automations, thank you emails triggered by purchases, check-ins based on time lapses. Each one worded like a conversation, not a transaction. Still thinking about you. We noticed you haven't stopped by. We get it, life's full. We're still here when you're ready. The goal was to create a digital presence that felt like someone behind the screen actually cared. As we did. Or at least, I did. Next came the influencer outreach. I scheduled casual drop-ins, offered store credit, but more importantly, I told them the truth. I didn't pitch a brand, I shared a rebuilding. My family runs this store, I wrote, and we almost lost it. We're trying to come back, not just with products but with people. Want to come see? 3 of them replied within the day. One posted a photo of our herbal tea shelf with the caption, "Local store. Honest story. Sometimes wellness looks like survival, and that's okay." It got more engagement than anything we'd posted in months. I didn't tell Ethan. I didn't need to. The numbers did. Foot traffic ticked up. Website clicks jumped. One customer told the cashier, "I saw you guys on my feed and remembered how much I used to love this place." And through all of it I stayed in the background. Still not part of leadership. Still not listed on the About Us page. But I didn't care. I wasn't doing this to be seen. I was doing it because it mattered. I came in early and left late, but not out of desperation. Out of rhythm. I was finally doing work that matched my internal pace. Intuitive, emotional, data-backed. For once, the pieces of me that had always been too much, the sensitivity, the analysis, the endless loop of what if, finally had a place to go. One morning I found a sticky note next to the register. Sophie's handwriting. Need updated copy for wellness kits. Yours hit better. It wasn't a compliment exactly, but it was a shift. Linda began sitting in the store more often. Not in her cold accounting mode, but softer. She greeted a few customers by name. Once she even corrected Ethan when he brushed off my suggestion about a pop-up event. Let her try, she said simply. I didn't react. I just made the pop-up happen. And when it sold out in 3 hours, Ethan nodded at me once from across the counter. That was his version of gratitude. I didn't expect more. I didn't need it. But something had changed. Not in their personalities, they were still them. But in the space. There was movement now. Acknowledgement. Small permissions. Quiet respect. And more than anything, I had changed. I no longer looked for my worth in their faces. I found it in the systems I built. In the customers who returned. In the messages that read, "Thank you for showing up for us." In the peace that came when I realized I didn't have to raise my voice to be powerful. I didn't need to win the room anymore. I was the room. It started with little things. A pause in Ethan's tone when I entered a conversation. Sophie handing me the marketing calendar without the usual eye roll. Linda asking softly, "Do you think we should try something new for the fall line?" No fireworks. No public acknowledgement. But the air had shifted. The condescension wasn't gone, but it was quieter now. Less assumption, more consideration. They didn't say I was right. But they stopped treating me like I didn't exist. And that, in a family like mine, was seismic. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I'd long since learned that in families like ours, validation doesn't arrive in full sentences. It shows up in changed behavior, in eye contact that lasts half a second longer, in tasks handed over without sarcasm. It's never, "We were wrong about you." It's, "Can you handle this?" And the answer was yes. I'd been handling it for years. They just hadn't seen it. The store was stabilizing. Revenue was slowly climbing. Customer engagement was stronger than it had been in years. Ethan said it was the loyalty system. Sophie credited the refreshed branding. Linda said, "Sometimes timing just shifts." No one mentioned me directly. But that was okay. Because they were finally implementing what I had built. Every shelf now had a small note card with a story. "This herbal blend helped my dad sleep after long nights." Or, "Our founder believed wellness wasn't a product. It was a relationship." I wrote them all. Customers took photos. Shared them. People came back just to see what the new messages would say. We weren't just selling groceries. We were rebuilding trust. One afternoon I walked in to find Sophie arguing with the vendor rep about shelf space. Midway through she turned to me. "Rachel, what do you think?" 4 words. But they hit like thunder. Because that was the first time in the history of this business that my opinion was requested, not tolerated. And I gave it, not nervously, not cautiously, but with quiet clarity. "We should prioritize emotional placement," I said. "Don't put the high-ticket items where people feel pressured. Put the comforting ones like tea, bread, honey, up front. Anchor them in familiarity." The vendor blinked. Sophie nodded. And that was that. Later that week I caught Ethan watching me from across the store. Not suspiciously. Just watching. He didn't say anything. But when he restocked the smoothie fridge, he left the label redesigned to me. No notes. No micromanagement. It didn't feel like trust yet. But it didn't feel like dismissal either. At night I still spiraled sometimes. Still lay awake wondering if the ground would shift again. That's the thing about high-functioning anxiety. It doesn't leave just because the room gets safer. But I was learning to live with it differently now. Naming it. Softening with it. Breathing through the tension instead of trying to outrun it. And every day as I walked into the store I reminded myself, they don't have to give me a title. They don't have to say thank you. They don't even have to like me. They just have to feel what I've built. That's what leadership is, isn't it? Influence without noise. Direction without ego. I used to think I needed them to see me. Now I knew, I only needed to see myself clearly. It didn't feel like forgiveness. It felt like accuracy. Because for once I wasn't the anxious little sister who overreacted. I was the strategist who saved the business they almost lost. Recognition is a strange thing. When you've gone your whole life being overlooked, you start imagining how it might feel to finally be seen. A speech maybe. Thank you. A moment where someone says, "You were right," and means it. I used to rehearse those scenes in my head like a movie I was never cast in. But the truth? That scene never came. The store rebounded. Revenue climbed steadily. The community re-engaged. Even the vendors who once dismissed us were suddenly interested in deeper partnerships. Monroe Market became a small business comeback story. Slow, sincere, and entirely off the radar of anyone who didn't live in our neighborhood. But inside the walls felt different now. More flexible. Less brittle. Like the structure had bent but didn't break. Customers would stop me sometimes not knowing I was family. "This place feels warmer," they'd say. Like someone finally started listening. I'd smile and say, "We're trying," and leave it at that. Because I wasn't doing this to be known. I was doing this so something good could survive. Still, there was a quiet ache, something I didn't want to admit. I wanted my family to name it. Just once. To say, "Rachel did this." But they didn't. Not in words. Not in any way I had grown up craving. Ethan never acknowledged the deck. Never once said, "Good job." But I noticed he stopped interrupting me in meetings. He started listening with his whole body, shoulders square, eyes steady. That, in our family, was monumental. Sophie, always the sharpest tongue in the room, softened at the edges. She stopped calling me, "our sensitive one," in that mocking voice. Started asking for my input directly, especially on messaging. She still rolled her eyes sometimes, but less like dismissal, more like old habit. Once, while setting up the window display, she muttered, "This store would have died without you." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure I was meant to hear it. Linda remained Linda. Measured, composed, almost unreadable. But she started sending emails at odd hours. "Saw this article on loyalty trends. Reminded me of what you mentioned last week." She began referencing my language in staff notes. "Let's lean into empathy. Keep messaging human." It wasn't warmth. But it was alignment. And in our family, alignment often meant more than affection. I still wasn't officially on the leadership team. No title change. No raise. Just more responsibility, more space, and more trust one had to interpret from glances and tone shifts. But I accepted it. Not because it was fair, but because it was real. Because this family never celebrated out loud. And maybe they never would. The truth is, I used to think recognition was a trophy, handed out when the crowd decided you'd earned it. Now I understand. For people like me, recognition isn't always handed over. Sometimes you build it brick by brick in the systems you change, the people you reach, the work that carries your fingerprint long after you leave the room. The day I launched our final phase, an emotional documentary-style video series about the store's journey, I watched the first edit alone. I sat in the back stockroom, the same one where I'd once overheard them laugh at me, and pressed play. It opened with a slow pan across the store, customers browsing, old photos of Dad, handwritten signs in the windows. Then my voice came in, not labeled, just heard. Sometimes the quietest ones are the ones holding everything together. You just don't see them until the noise dies down. I didn't cry. I just closed the laptop and breathed. No applause came. No one ran in and said, "That was brilliant." But that afternoon the store was fuller than it had been in months. Familiar faces. New ones. A mother and daughter hugged in front of the produce aisle. They didn't clap. But they stayed afloat. And for the first time that was enough. There's a moment in healing, not loud, not cinematic, when you realize the version of yourself you were chasing no longer exists. Not because you failed her, but because you outgrew the need to become her. That was me, somewhere between month 4 and 5 of quietly leading from behind. I wasn't trying to impress them anymore. I wasn't holding my breath waiting for the next eye roll or dismissal. I had stopped performing competence. I simply embodied it. The funny part, I was still anxious. Still double-checking campaigns. Still lying awake some nights with my brain rehearsing imaginary board meetings that would never happen. But now it didn't feel like dysfunction. It felt like preparedness. Like my brain's worst-case scenarios were less about fear and more about foresight. My anxiety hadn't vanished, but it had transformed into intuition. Something I could listen to instead of run from. At home I started noticing changes too. I took longer walks without headphones, drank my coffee slowly, started saying no to things I used to say yes to out of guilt. When Linda asked if I could come over and fix the budget spreadsheet real quick, I responded with, "I'm not available this weekend, maybe Monday." There was a pause on the line. But she didn't argue. She just said, "Okay." That "okay" felt like a tectonic shift. I began introducing myself differently in quiet ways. At events, when people asked what I did, I no longer said, "I help out at the family store." I said, "I handle strategic growth for a community-based wellness business." Because that's what it was. And more importantly, that's what I was doing. It still stung sometimes. Watching Ethan take credit in investor emails. Hearing Sophie talk to vendors like the ideas had been hers. But the sting didn't last as long anymore. Because I knew. And more importantly, the customers knew. And in a strange way, I had found peace in being the quiet architect. We launched a community initiative called Small Steps, encouraging customers to share small wins in their wellness journeys. It was Rachel branded from top to bottom, rooted in behavioral psychology, structured for slow habit change, dripping in empathy. Customers submitted handwritten cards each week. I replaced soda with tea. I finally made it to therapy. I walked instead of drove today. We pinned them on a board at the front of the store. By week 2, the board was full. Customers weren't just shopping anymore. They were showing up. And that board, that was the kind of recognition I'd never dared to dream of. Not from family, but from the people who mattered. Sophie caught me standing in front of it one day. She didn't say much. Just, "This was a good idea." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The proof was right there in blue ink and scratchy handwriting. This was the new identity I never expected. Not the anxious little sister begging to be heard, but the quiet strategist who redefined what leadership could look like. Unapologetically soft in a world that confused harshness with strength. Even Ethan, in his gruff, efficiency-driven way, began to shift. He still couldn't say thank you in full sentences, but he asked me to run the next campaign without oversight. That, in his language, was an offering. I accepted. Because now I didn't need to take up space like they did. I had carved out a space that was entirely my own. Built on insight, not ego. On resonance, not recognition. This identity didn't need applause. It just needed truth. And I was full of it now. I never asked for this legacy. I didn't grow up dreaming about organic shelves, spreadsheets, or point-of-sale systems. I wasn't the one Dad trained after school. That was Ethan. I wasn't the one he called sharp or unnatural. That was Sophie. I was the one in the corner drawing mind maps and asking too many questions about people's feelings. The soft one. The weird one. The one who cried too easily and stayed quiet too long. So no, I didn't ask for this. But I showed up anyway. Because when the foundation cracked, when the numbers dipped and the brand lost its heartbeat, it wasn't logic or ambition or branding that brought it back. It was empathy. It was noticing. It was my anxiety, the very thing they mocked, that caught the patterns they ignored. When they called me dramatic, I was tracking customer hesitation. When they said I was too sensitive, I was absorbing emotional signals the data hadn't caught yet. When they said I wasn't cut out for business, I was already redesigning the way this business could connect with real human beings. Now, as I walk the aisles of a store that finally feels like a living, breathing part of something bigger, I know this truth with certainty. They built the store. But I rebuilt the soul. Not with dominance. Not with status. But with emotional intelligence sharpened by years of being invisible. With behavioral insight honed by sleepless nights and inner battles no one else ever saw. With strategy rooted in softness, not ego. There's a photo of Dad near the entrance now. Not a huge one, just a small framed shot of him in the early days. He's standing next to a wooden crate of apples, smiling in that tired, proud way he always did. Below it is a quote we chose together. Start small. Stay honest. Serve people. It used to feel like a cliché. Now it feels like prophecy. Because that's exactly what I did. I started small. A whispered voice, a quiet pitch, a folder left on a desk with no fanfare. I stayed honest, even when it hurt, even when it meant admitting how badly I wanted to be seen. And I served people, not just our customers but the family who never quite knew what to do with me. I gave them something none of them could name but all of them needed. Direction. They still don't talk about it, not really. There's no dinner conversation about how I turned things around. No family group text celebrating milestones. Ethan still runs operations. Sophie still curates the visual branding. Linda still controls the books. I just exist in between. Present. Trusted. Essential though never officially acknowledged. And that's okay now. Because I didn't just save a business. I reclaimed myself. I used to think I was the anxious one, the overreactor, the irrelevant youngest. Now I know I'm the strategist. The backbone. The one who quietly watched the storm roll in and built shelter while everyone else argued about whose fault it was. They'll never tell that version of the story. But I will. Because the legacy I inherited was a structure. The legacy I leave behind is a soul. And for the first time I don't just belong here. I define here.